Some of what I'll be saying is much more aimed at the at the social level. Now, to start off, I'm not so sure how much I'll have to say, strictly speaking, about specifically philosophical perspectives. Yes, I am a philosopher by training, and I am going to be talking about a particular perspective, but I'm not sure how that makes it particularly philosophical perspective. What I can say is that philosophers have skills. They have a very particular set of skills. Skills they have obtained over a course of very long career, quite often. Skills that make them a nightmare for people at parties. They will examine your reasoning, they will identify your premises, and they will point out the shortcomings in your argumentation. And the worst thing, there's never an end to it. Kind of like the science and religion dialogue. So I won't be trying to finish the dialogue here today. All I'll be trying to do is trying to make a few very basic points, two basic points, really. One is to try and answer why it is that this dialogue has been so very difficult to carry out. Okay? And the second point, and frankly, I think the second point is almost trivial, is what it is that philosophers can do to help. Let me begin with a particular personal story. When I finished my master's degree, I had spent, a while at university learning all about how to dissect arguments. And I went to visit my brother. And I ended up spending quite a bit of time talking to his stepdaughter, 11 years old at the time. Not a realistic portrayal. And after a few days, I realized that I was doing something very peculiar talking to her. I was constantly analyzing everything that she did, and everything she said, very much like the way that one philosopher would analyze another philosopher. But this was, of course, completely inappropriate. In effect, I was simply being an intellectual bully, right? So that experience, I hope, has given me an awareness that when you want to carry out a dialogue, there's more that's required than simply being able to analyze the other person's argument. So when I was asked by Christine to come over here, I was very, very pleased to hear that she was going to ask us to talk about the science and religion dialogue, not the science and religion debate. Why? Well, debates are fun. Philosophers love them, right? Kind of like cage fights. They're fun too, right? But frankly, quite often, if we look at debates, they're not very constructive, right? Kind of like cage fights, right? Well, except for within academia, right? Scientists are capable of having a debate and quite often settling an issue quite quickly. But that's quite unusual. Now somebody could say, well, hold on, why is that the case? Surely, if we provide people with more evidence, that leads to something more like a consensus view being formed. And relevant points have already been raised earlier that we have this thing which is called confirmation bias, which leads to this not being necessarily the case. And I'd like to remind everyone of the famous study where a group of people that had a variety of views on a particular position were provided with additional evidence for and against their views, and instead of coming towards something like a consensus, became more polarized in their views. Why? Because they were ignoring much of the evidence against their views and simply listening to the evidence for their views. So, simply presenting the evidence, simply having a debate, isn't going to necessarily settle anything at all. Right? So, as I said, it's very interesting that in science you do manage quite often to reach consensus quite quickly. Now, part of that, I'm sure, is due to the kinds of rules of argumentation you do get within science, the kind of stuff that, among others, philosophers of science are looking at, right? But I think there's more to it than that. Often we think about the fact that science is highly competitive, but let's think about what kind of competition you get within science. What kind of work gets rewarded? The work that is most useful to other scientists, right? The results, the research that is useful to other scientists. Of course, this isn't a 100% rule by any means, but there is a very strong tendency in this direction. So in other words, what's being rewarded is activity, behavior, which in that context, within that community, is pro-social, is in fact cooperative. Now, this might sound like what I'm trying to suggest here is to have this dialogue is all going to be, cute kittens and puppies, right? A feel-good kind of chit-chat where we're going to, the theists and the non-theists, or the theists and the scientists are going to get together, and we're going to say, hey, I believe in angels, you believe in evolution, and that's all just fine, right? No, that's not what I'm talking about. To have a dialogue, it is not necessary to avoid evaluation of the positions that are being presented. I'd go further. I'd say that one shouldn't avoid evaluation of the positions, right? Very often I get the feeling that when people say, we must respect another person's beliefs, that goes counter to respecting them as people. Because what you're saying is, we're not going to engage fully with them, right? We're going to treat them as children to a certain degree. In fact, one could say a dialogue cannot avoid evaluation of these positions simply because when we get presented with these positions, we start evaluating them. The question being how well we do this, right? Now, something that Bruce touched upon and I think is quite important when we consider the science-religion dialogue and what the point of this dialogue could possibly be, is that through this dialogue, neither religion nor science are going to disappear. Right? The old idea that the scientists are going to beat the theists in intellectual combat and get rid of religion, well, that has been found to be false by the scientists. Right? Of course, individual beliefs may well be affected by, debates of all sorts. But on the social level, religion doesn't disappear because of these kinds of considerations. Right? We do have the phenomenon of secularization in a number of societies, but the best evidence we have, and of course this isn't a completely settled issue, but the best evidence we have suggests that the reasons are fundamentally sociological and economic, not intellectual. Right? So the dialogue isn't about beating the other side. The dialogue is about facing the fact that these different kinds of people, these different kinds of commitments do come into conflict in various situations, but they will continue existing within the society, and we have to find ways to reconcile them somehow. Okay, so why has this dialogue been so difficult? 5 minutes, good God. That's typical for the speakers today, isn't it? Well, before I answer that question, I have some good news. I'm about to reveal to you next draw's numbers for the Lotto Texas, okay? The numbers will be, I hope you've got papers and paper, sorry, pens and paper here. 1, 2, 4, 10, 15, and 54. Everybody got that? Great. You probably will be less pleased to hear that I have absolutely no reason whatsoever to believe that this is correct. Okay? The usefulness of what I have just told you is vitally tied to its accuracy. If I have given you the wrong numbers, what I have just told you is useless. In fact, worse than useless, you're going to waste your money. And that's the usual case with beliefs that humans have. But let's consider a different example. Imagine a group of hunters, right? They want to bring down some big game. Whether they will be successful depends on them cooperating. And they could cooperate for a number of very different reasons. One of them could be that they believe that when they get back to the village, their vengeful chieftain will punish anybody who didn't pull their weight on the hunt. So, the fact that he's going to punish them causes them to cooperate. No. That would be backward causation. What causes them to cooperate is the belief that the chieftain will punish them. The chieftain could be dead by now, it doesn't matter. Right? So we have this interesting case where the function of the belief, let's say the function of this belief is to cause cooperation, is tied merely to it being believed and not to it being true. Right? Whoops, that jumped very quickly, didn't it? Obviously, the slides want to go faster too. All right, so what about religious beliefs? I mean, we've talked about all kinds of examples of possible function of religious claims. The typical one that's made is that they, in some way, and I think, the kind of stuff that Azim and Will talked about is great here, but in some way they're tied to motivating pro-social behavior, right? Let's think about that. Does their ability to motivate pro-social behavior depend upon their being true? No. That's not relevant. We can think of another example. Giving meaning to individual lives. I mean, we don't have to come down on either side of the debate of whether this is something that is a function of religious beliefs or not, but if it is a function, is that tied to their being true? Right? Well, it doesn't seem to be. I mean, think about the idea that you get quite often. People saying, look, I couldn't possibly live my life if I believed that this is all there is. There is no life after death. Well, if we take this at face value, the fact of whether there is heaven or there isn't is irrelevant. All that's relevant is that the person believes that there is a heaven, that they might go to. Okay, so how is the plausibility of these kinds of beliefs maintained? Well, Bob, primarily, has said quite a bit about the kinds of considerations, cognitive considerations, that do render a lot of these kinds of beliefs natural. But they need to do more than that. Right? They do need to be protected in some manner against potential counter-evidence. On the social scale, right? Minimize the potential counter-evidence, minimize the destabilizing factors. There are lots of different ways to do this, but the one that I really want to consider today is social attitudes, right? So take the following example, the Shroud of Turin. Right? For a very long time, we couldn't test how old it was because we lacked the technology. Then we invented carbon dating. but it couldn't be used upon the Shroud of Turin because it was considered too sacred to take any samples from it. Once this was gotten over, samples were taken with the results indicating that the Shroud of Turin comes from the Middle Ages. So the notion of it being sacred was something that protected it against being destabilized by counter-evidence. I mean, the general point to make is that if you have beliefs whose function is not tied to their truth, it doesn't make any sense to select among those beliefs on the basis of their accuracy. It's irrelevant. It's just as irrelevant as whether you can sing them in iambic pentameter. Right? So we get to the fundamental problem. It isn't just that science and religion are making different claims. Science and religion are relying upon different attitudes to how we should treat those claims. Okay? Now, some people like to say, oh, religious individuals are thin-skinned or thick-skulled or whatever. No, this isn't a question of individual whim. This is right down at the core of how these social institutions work. Right? For religions to function well, they need to protect these beliefs that if they are true coincidentally. Now, we need to contrast that with the kinds of attitudes that are necessary to have open dialogue. And hopefully, because I don't have enough time to go into it, we can see that there is going to be a clash here between treating things as sacred and having an open dialogue about them. Right? So these kinds of things run counter to each other. But of course, as I said before, dialogue is vital. Neither religion nor science are necessarily going to go away in the near time, at least not in a number of societies. Secularization takes a couple of hundred years, right? So we need to have dialogue. So, well, how can philosophers help? Well, obviously, there is no easy solution to this. Right? We can say all kinds of nice things about trying to understand each other and so on and so forth, but there is no easy solution. But there are two things that philosophers are taught that I think are relevant here. One, I've already talked about, how to examine arguments. The other one, and I think this has been extremely well evidenced, not just by the philosophers, but by scientists here today also, is that if you're going to engage with anyone about the views, about the position, etc., the very first thing you need to do, before you start criticizing, before you start evaluating, is you need to come to have a really profound, deep understanding of where they're coming from. Now, philosophers, unfortunately, quite easily forget about this. I forgot about this when I was dealing with the 11-year-old stepdaughter of my brother's, right? But this is something that's vital to do if we're going to have a dialogue here. Now, good thing is, after that couple of days, I did realize I was making a mistake, and I did actually engage in a proper dialogue with my brother's stepdaughter, and it was great. Bright, open, curious 11-year-old was wonderful fun. And I hope, something that both of us learned quite a bit from. Okay, that is indeed all.